Welcome to the Ghost Show online, my fiends, booze, and ghouls. Your hosts, Seika Groves, Rachel Benter, and Ian Russell will discuss all things paranormal. Prepare to be afraid.
Today's show, we're going to talk about what's behind me in this picture is these little miniature coffins that were discovered in Scotland in the 1800s. And it's a very little known story. Not too many people know about these interesting little coffins and their contents and sort of what or why these little things exist. And I think that we still don't really know why they exist. Really, it's kind of a guess.
That will be a mystery.
It's a bit of a guessing game, and people are, hypothesizing about what they think it's all about. But let's talk about why we chose this. I just thought it was a really fascinating subject. It's never talked about. I don't know if anybody's ever done a podcast on this, so we could be going down
the rabbit hole, as it
were. Down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. Down a rabbit hole.
Indeed.
They're known as the fairy coffins because of their size. They're very small. They're like 4 inches. So they're just little coffins. And each one of them has a little representation of a human body inside. Originally, it is said that 17 of them were found. So I'm going to discuss an article that came out in the London Times, because this is really where we first learn about these little objects and what they are and this strange discovery. So for me, oh my goodness, would I love to have these in my oddities collection.
Oh yes, I know you definitely would.
Yeah.
Oh,
they're very fascinating.
Even one would be phenomenal. But
yes.
Let me read this
of course
article. It's a little bit long, but it's not too long, and I'm going to read it off my phone, so just because it's there. But London Times, July 20, 1836. It says, that early in July 1836, some boys were searching for rabbit burrows down the rabbit hole for rabbit burrows in a rocky formation near Edinburgh, known as Arthur's Seat. In the side of a cliff, they came upon some thin sheets of slate, and they pulled them out. Little cave. 17 tiny coffins, 3 or 4 inches long. In the coffins were miniature wooden figures. They were dressed differently in both style and material. There were 2 tiers of 8 coffins each, and a third tier with 1 coffin. The extraordinary datum, which was especially made mystery here. So this is a direct quote. It says that the coffins had been deposited singularly in little cave at the intervals of many years. In the first tier, the coffins were quite decayed, and the wrappings had moldered away. In the second tier, the effects of age had not advanced so far, and the top coffin was quite recent looking. So this is Fort, who used to write for the London Times, short account. It says it's so accurate. And as far as everything goes, in terms of the time, they believe that at that point, these little coffins were made in the late 1700s. Mm-hmm. So there was 17 coffins originally discovered. Today, there's only 8.
Oh,
I wonder where the rest
that's a shame.
Who has them in their collection? Come forward. I'm
looking. This one check your ass attic, everybody.
I would love to know who has the other 9 of them in the collection. Right? Because there's only 8. There was only ever 8. It says fewer than half of them survived. And the Scotsman, which is another newspaper, which first published the account, explained a number were destroyed by the boys pelting them at each other as unmeaning and contemptible trifles. So I guess the kids found them and then they were just throwing them down the hill at each other, and they ruined some of them. Those were brought down that still were intact from the hillside. They eventually found their way to a gentleman by the name of Robert Fraser. Now, this is a Fraser, Z-I-E-R, as opposed to Fraser, S-E-R. So we'll just note that that's a different spelling. He was a South Andrews street jeweler. So in Edinburgh, he had a jewelry shop, and he had these little coffins on display in his private museum. So when he retired in 1845, the collection was auctioned off.
Oh.
For a whopping £4. So that's a pretty
That
good,
was a lot of money, I imagine, back then.
right? So we know that it's certainly
Quite a lot.
purchased by somebody who didn't have any money, right? You would have had to have some means. £4 was pretty good cost in those days. So the coffins thus passed into unknown private hands, and they remained there until 1901. So this is the 8 that we still have today, because the 9, presumably, the children ruined, but did they really? Maybe they only gave 8 of them away. So we don't really know, because there's not a lot of information on what happened to the other 9, other than that account of the kids throwing them down the hill at each other, just around. So we now have the National Museum of Scotland, who is in possession of these amazing little unique coffins that are 3 to 4 inches long. So what do you guys think about these? What do you think they are? And why were there 17 of them buried in 3 tiers, quite the ways up of the side of the hill?
Well,
over
I don't know. I'm going to take a guess. I'm going to theorize here.
Right? So
I asked my husband what he thought of them, and he suggested that maybe they were symbolic of relatives that had deceased abroad, say in England, and they, obviously they couldn't bring the body home, so maybe they did a representation of that. Of the coffin and the person, the the relative that they'd lost.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. What do you think, Ian? Is there any?
Well, I've got some references here to some theories about that.
Right.
Okay.
And this is sort of where my interest in all of this lays is in these theories.
Well, mine's in one of them for sure.
And I'm sure I'm going to touch on what you're going to mention.
You are.
But the first one I've got here is that, considering the time period, is that one theory says is that these were voodoo dolls used within a witchcraft type of thing.
Okay.
There is another theory that says that these were a tribute to sailors who were lost at sea in a shipwreck.
Okay.
And then there is a more modern theory with 2 guys, Irish laborers, William Burke and William Hare.
Yes, the 2 Williams.
Yep. And at that time period, it was popular for, let's say, the body snatchers, if you know what I mean.
Oh.
That people would go out, they would body snatch out of cemeteries, digging up the bodies to sell them to medical schools for profit. Now, the difference between those people and these 2 guys is that these 2 guys weren't grave robbing. They were going out and they were murdering people and then taking the bodies directly to the... So there's this theory that the 17 miniature coffins and the figurines were a tribute to the victims who never received a proper burial because of Burke and Hare.
Right. And Burke and Hare is absolutely one of my favorite macabre.
I love that one.
Of the Georgian period. If folks are not familiar with Burke and Hare, there is a film, and while it's slightly comedic because it has Simon Pegg in it, it's actually really, really well done. And it's one of my favorite films, and it's literally called Burke and Hare. But these two guys, let's just note, and I'm not doing this to pick and point, but they were two Irish immigrants in Edinburgh looking for work. So at that time, we're looking at, it's pre-potato famine period in Ireland, but it's also still under the, Northern Ireland's under the repression of England. And so people are not having the best of times in Ireland at this period. There's a lot of people out of work. So Burke and Hare leave and they go to Edinburgh looking for work. Now, did they look to become, the most well-known serial killers in Edinburgh's history? Probably not. But it kind of fell in their lap. So, and I say that because they met each other essentially at a rooming house. They were both living in a rooming house. And even though they were both Irish, they didn't know each other, as far as we know, prior to them meeting in Edinburgh at this rooming house. And what happened is the woman who owned the rooming house passed away naturally. And they decided to take her body and sell it because she didn't have any relations. She didn't have any relatives. There was nobody. She had no children, no living relatives. And they knew this because they were living in the house. So people talked and you got to know people. And they figured, what the heck? Like, we're not really doing anything wrong here. She's got no family to bury her. She's going to end up in a pauper's field. Nobody's going to know who she is. So they kind of took her body and sold it for medical the use of medical experimentation / learning. So now we've got these guys running around Edinburgh at the turn of the century, and they've discovered a new calling, which is bodies, the selling of bodies. So Burke and Hare actually do murder 17 people. The majority of them are women, and they're women that they figure people aren't going to miss. So who are those women? Right? Women on the streets for the most part. It's not to say they all were, but they were pretty smart in the beginning about who they were going after. They were looking for people that had no attachments. Nobody would miss them. Nobody would know they were gone. And then they did finally get caught on number 17. So
awesome. What happened to them?
Right. And this is over a number of years. This is not, they didn't all do it in a week. And, it was over the course of quite a few years. But such an interesting story. And then, of course, when they get caught by the cops, one of them turns Crown evidence against the other.
Oh.
And so one essentially doesn't get hanged. And the other.
Oh, I thought they were both hanged.
Well, they eventually, yes, but he turned state's evidence or, Crown evidence.
Oh, naughty.
Against him. So the other interesting thing is that one of them now resides in the medical museum in Edinburgh. And you can go and you can see his skeleton on display.
No way.
At the university. So an interesting story. So Burke was actually executed. So he was the one that was hanged. Hare escaped by literally confessing against Burke. So he was now, again, eventually, they kind of get caught up with each other. But Burke is the one that hangs. Burke's body is now in the museum in Edinburgh, and you can go and look at him on display. So I find it all kind of rather ironic and interesting.
Yeah, the irony that his body became what he was doing, that he was selling people. Right. Yeah, now his...
Were they bad guys? Oh yeah, they murdered 17 people. But it's kind of a strange thing. It's like, I'm not going to give them any leeway for their heinous crimes, but at the same time, you can almost understand why they're doing this, because there's poverty. They have nothing. They can't get work.
Yeah, they're desperate.
Essentially desperate.
Yeah.
And, so desperate people do desperate things. And so now we get back to these great little coffins. The little figures inside the coffins, they're all hand carved, as are the coffins. So the coffins are actually carved out of one, like a solid piece of wood. They're not glued together, joined, or they're just carved out. So somebody was getting, a branch large enough, a piece of wood large enough to actually carve them. They're rather crude and rudimentary, as you can see by the picture behind me. There's nothing particularly fancy, but it looks like it may have been done by more than one person, maybe two people, because we have two pretty distinct styles. We have the one with the rather rounded ends, and then we have the very square ones. So that could indicate that two people were actually carving these. Or simply somebody decided they wanted to vary between the shapes of the coffins and made rounded corners and square corners. We'll never know, because we don't know who did them. The figures that are inside, for the most part, everybody who looks at them wants to deem them as male. And I'm sort of two minds here.
Yeah.
They're very rudimentary. They're not meant to, they're representations, not necessarily literal exactings of
exactly.
In some cases, the arms have even been lobbed off, or things have been shortened because they didn't fit in the little coffin after it was done. So they're, one arm is missing or two arms are missing. And this was done by the artist, not, after the fact. They didn't just break off and get lost. This was actually something done. In terms of the clothing, so let's talk about the clothing. Did you guys have a chance to actually look at this stuff up close? Because
that's interesting because the stitching who is relevant in knowledge in that kind of ancient stitching, analyzed the threads and said, oh yes, this thread is from such and such time period, because this type of thread did not exist before such and such date.
I can explain that, because prior to 1800, we have thread that's generally one or two strands in thickness. So in order to have a stronger thread, they would spin two pieces together to give it more durability. But by 1800 and around 1810 to 1812 particularly, three twine thread becomes the favorite because it's very strong. So it's three strands of thread that are twisted together. Coats, the manufacturer that still manufactures today, was manufacturing thread in that time period. And they made commercially available to the public three-strand or three-twine thread. They were one of the first to do it. So it's a really interesting story that you can look back and date. Now, when I look at the garments that are on these figurines, for the most part, I'm just going to lean this way. We can see this one right here. This one right here.
Yeah.
Where are we? There we go.
It's more patterned, isn't it? The material.
Because it's patterned.
Yeah.
It's not patterned commercially. So this was not a fabric that you could purchase commercially at the time. This was hand inked.
Oh, wow.
So they actually drew that little pattern. More than likely, once they wrapped the doll, they drew the pattern onto the fabric, because there's areas of the fabric that do not have any pattern on it if you're able to actually look at some of the pictures. And as I said, I was really lucky because I was able to get into the back end of the research archives to really have a look at this, and to look more deeply at these outfits on these these figures. I won't go as far as to call them dolls because I don't believe they had any reference to being ever a doll. They're an effigy or a figure, a representation, loose representation of a person. Why did they all look masculine? Probably because it was just way easier to carve a straight figure without trying to make it look feminine.
Yeah, it seemed more important for whoever created them or owned them for them to fit into the boxes, because if you notice the arms are missing, it seems like the priority is for it to fit in the box as opposed to keeping the arms on it and not fitting in the box.
Right.
So yeah,
which makes us feel that it definitely is just meant to be a representation. It's not meant to be literal or 100% lifelike and accurate in terms of who are in these little coffins. So how do you feel about the story about the sailors? The story that Ian discovered about the possibility of a shipwreck with a number of sailors, that perhaps this was something that it was representative of. Now that we've talked about this, how do you feel about that?
It's possible, but I tend to gravitate towards the Burke and Hare theory.
Yeah, same here. Yeah.
Well, and I find that interesting because, first of all, for me, I don't believe it's shipwreck, not because of the effigies themselves, but because it's fairly clear that these were buried at different times. So you had 8, and then there was, however much time went between, could have been a year, could have been more, and then there was 8 more. And then the fact that the very last one was virtually looked like it had just been placed there.
Yeah.
Tells us that this was going on for probably a period of, they figure, maybe 20 years.
Oh.
So even in terms of Burke and Hare, I'm not sure I'm buying into that either.
Well, that's a long time period.
Yeah. Well,
20 years is a long time.
It is.
And I'm sure Burke and Hare weren't doing this for 20 years.
Well, no, they weren't. And they were also caught and dealt with.
Yeah.
While it makes for a really great story, I'm not really sure even this is a Burke and Hare thing. I mean, it works because there's 17 coffins, but from the way that these were laid out, it sounds like the intention was to continue with more coffins as they go, because there was already a lower layer, a middle layer, and they were working on a new layer at the top. But only one coffin was there when the boys found this. So if the boys had never found this, how many coffins may have been in there? Who knows? There could have been, it was quite a large hole that they had dug into the side of the hillside. It wasn't just enough to wedge these little caskets in. It was actually, it had quite enough room to put several more layers. So that kind of tells me that this is more than Burke and Hare. As much as I love Burke and Hare and I love the story of Burke and Hare.
I love the Burke and Hare story, but that's just me. I love things like that.
I just don't think it
but
works.
yeah.
I don't think the sailor story really works either, because if this was to represent sailors that went down in a shipwreck, then it
would have all been categorized
together at the same time.
Yeah. Right. And the other thing is, could this have been perhaps people who died in the village around the location where this was? I mean, I know they say Edinburgh, and it's in the Edinburgh Museum right now, but Arthur's Seat is outside the city. And if we go back to the late 1700s, Edinburgh certainly wasn't what it is today, but at the same time, you have outlying villages and areas that perhaps this was a representation of maybe people that died within a certain
I was actually surprised when I was doing the research, looking it up, that it came up as Arthur's Seat, the Arthur's Seat coffin, coffins.
Right.
I did a little bit of looking at that, and if you look at the Arthur's Seat, if you look at the landscape, if you are able to get a picture view, maybe on Google Earth, you can see that there's I was surprised to learn that it's a long extinct volcano.
Edinburgh's sitting on a long extinct volcano.
Yeah.
So,
I've got an interesting question here.
Okay.
And it's just a stupid question, but okay. Arthur's Seat, it's called that because it is claimed to be the location of where King Arthur had Camelot.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do you think there's a possibility that these 17 statues could be related to the story of King Arthur and his knights?
Oh, okay.
How many knights are there?
There you go. Can you?
Is there about 12 knights?
There, I don't know how. As I say, I guess we all kind of froze up there, or somebody froze up.
No, did we freeze up? Sorry, I was thinking. I was in surprise because that was sort of a revelation.
Is claimed to be the location of where King Arthur had Camelot.
Yes.
So my dumb question here is, do you think there could be a reference with these figures to the King Arthur story? Well, considering the location of where these figures were found on what is supposed to be where King Arthur's Camelot was supposedly been.
So there originally in the story, there's 25 knights at the round table. So it's possible
25, not 12. I don't know why.
It was creating 25 effigies and just didn't get that far. And
as you say, if it appears that there, so we had 17.
Mm-hmm.
If it appears that there may have been plans for more,
yes,
interesting that there could actually be a King Arthur connection.
But if you go back to the time of the Anglo-Saxons, so about the period of the Viking invasions, 750 to about 900, you still have a lot of Wales that's very much living in its own little universe. So I feel like Wales is, for me, the spot for Arthur. Now, why in the world Edinburgh would want to claim that, I'm not even sure. Seeing that the story, when we even go back and read the original poems, because they were poems that were written originally, and they weren't written until, I believe it was either the late Middle Ages or the early Renaissance. So, and even later than that too, like some of them get into the 1700s, right? So the whole idea of introducing Guinevere into the story doesn't come until the 1700s.
Oh.
So and written by French poets. So these stories perpetuate, but certainly there's enough to think that somewhere in Wales, in sort of between Wales and possibly Shropshire area of the UK, could Camelot have existed? Sure. I feel Edinburgh is a real stretch. I mean, I don't know. It just seems like, it seems like one of those stories where let's call this Arthur's Seat and it'll be great for tourism.
Essentially, yes.
I know that it's been called Arthur's Seat for quite a while, but we have to remember that even in the 1700s, people traveling to locations, there were people traveling sheer adventure-wise, people with money and wealth. So if you could say that you were the home of Arthur's legend in Camelot, that's going to draw people to your city. That's going to bring people in. And of course, that story had a real renaissance again in the Victorian era, right? Yes. It really became super popular in the Victorian era. It had kind of died out for a whole lot of years. And then in the Victorian era, when, everybody sort of sees it as this period of romance, along comes this poem that this poet has written and put Guinevere into the story, and suddenly it's the perfect tale to tell in Victorian times. Right, so it becomes very popular. But do I believe that Arthur's seat in Edinburgh is anything to do with Arthur and Camelot? No, but does that mean that these little coffins don't have anything to do with Arthur's seat and the idea of the 25 knights of the Round Table? It's possible. These are all just going to be hypothetical at this point. I don't think we're ever going to know the real story of who.
No, because we don't know. You got all these theories out there, and all the theories are contradicting one another. And even today, here in 2022, no one still knows for sure.
Well, and that's the thing. That's what makes these stories so fascinating, because we don't really have a cut and dry absolute here as to why somebody went out of their way. And do we also know, was there really ever 17 coffins?
That's a good point. No, we don't really know that. There's no proof.
The story is the boys threw them at each other and they broke. And I mean, knowing boys, that's entirely possible too. Mm-hmm. But you would still know where you threw those pieces, and somebody may come back, especially if the story here is that the boys actually told their teacher about what they did. And the teacher was the one that they gave these remaining coffins to. He is the one that sold them to the jeweler in Edinburgh. So do we even believe the story? Because there's no boys' names mentioned in any of the stories. Any articles, the newspaper articles, not even a first name as a reference. Just 3 boys were out looking for rabbits on the hillside in Arthur's seat. I mean, what if 3 boys didn't actually discover these? And what if this teacher, perhaps out walking his dog or doing whatever, happened to glance up the hill, see this piece of slate reflecting in the sunlight, and was curious and went up and found it and opened it up. And it does say that it looks like there were trowel marks. And that is something that, of course, if you found it, maybe you were going to go back and dig it out. So you bring your little garden's, trowel with you, and you go back up and you remove these pieces. Maybe there was only ever 8 of them. I mean, if you told your teacher 3 anonymous boys,
makes you wonder, really.
I'm not going to rule it out, but now you've got, the newspaper in Edinburgh doing an article about finding these pieces, and then the pieces being sold to the jeweler and then going up for auction. So do we have any really tangible anything prior to them going for auction? No. Because that's when the story comes in.
No. Yeah. I mean, if you really want to go there, he could have made them himself.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, these could have been created. I don't know that anybody's ever gone back to where this mysterious hole in the side of the mountain hill / Arthur's seat was. Because you read some descriptions, it sounds rather precarious to get to.
We will just have to go, and we'll
another one on the list.
Conclusive evidence ourselves.
Thank you for watching The Ghost Show Online. Join your hosts again next week as they discuss more tales of the supernatural, the paranormal, and all things spectacular. See you soon.